You know, you can find just about anything on the World Wide Web, right? Well, this week I ran across something that when I saw it, I simultaneously wanted to laugh and cry. And it was called the Rapture Index. The Rapture Index purports to be the prophetic speedometer of end-time activity. So I'm looking at this, and in case you're curious, the way it works is they've listed 45 categories. And they are things like floods and famine and Satanism, plagues, liberalism, all these different things, unemployment. And each category, each of these 45 categories, has a ranking between 1 and 5, depending upon the amount of activity that's perceived related to that category. So if the score, when they add them all up, if the score is 85 or less, it's very slow prophetic activity. And if it's above 145, they say next to it, hold on to your seatbelts. So basically, the higher the number, the faster we are moving towards the end of time, according to this website. So when I checked this week, the index was 183. We better hold on. There's a type of theological understanding called rapture theology, which generally states that at some point Jesus is going to call all the faithful and all the watchful to himself. And many people that think in these terms believe that they will be kind of caught up in the sky with Jesus on a cloud, and that Jesus will take them far away from this place. And then afterwards, the earth and all those who do not believe will be destroyed. Much of this type of thought of destruction and annihilation has been based out of the book of Revelation, and also some in Thessalonians, but predominantly people have questions about the book of Revelation. If you ask almost anyone, the book of the Bible that they least understand or scares them the most, they'll say Revelation. Well, last week, Carter and I were kind of talking about an unrelated topic a little bit. We were talking about unbinding the gospel, which some of us are doing. And I asked him, what do you think about it? And he said, well, there's not very much of a plot, and there's no suspense, and he has this sort of wicked sense of humor, and he says, but most importantly, Mom, there are no dragons. And I remember thinking, well, who knew that dragons were important to the story? Well, they are. And this week we've got dragons. Not only dragons, but violent seas and scary beasts. And the people are all captivated by it. Dragons are important to our story, not in like a fantastical, weird kind of way, but in the way that John, the pastor who writes the book of Revelation, really means it. Because the dragon is evil. And without question, there is evil in this world, and sometimes we follow it. And the beast is powerful. And without question, there are forces in the world which seek to defy God. And sometimes we are seduced by that power. And the sea swallows up those we love. And we do say, who can fight against it? The power and the evils and the wrongs of this world sometimes seem to be too much to stand up against. And so we end up on our knees begging for mercy from that which cannot give us mercy. We end up worshiping that which we despise. We end up worshiping the dragon, feeding the dragon what the dragon wants, just so we can stay safe. Like walking away from the fight because nothing's ever going to change anyway. Like pretending the way we spend our money, it doesn't affect anyone. deceiving ourselves that going with the flow is better than fighting against the tide. Dragons are hard to fight, and nobody ever said it was going to be easy. And Pastor John knew this 2,000 years ago when he looked at the politics and society and the church of that time. And 1,000 years ago, it was the same, different dragons, but same problems. And in 1517, when Luther was pastor, same thing. There were evils which crept in society and the church and the government. For as long as we can remember, the dragons have lurked among us. And so we may wonder if this beast is coming back at the end of time, but I don't really think that's the question that God's asking through John. I think the question that God is asking us is, where have we seen this beast before, and where is it now? Because this is not to come. This is present-day reality. It's not threat. It's not threat from God. Because what is to come is a whole different vision. A promise from God that the end is not the end. Because with God, it never is. Originally, when I began this Heaven and Hell sermon series, we were going to talk about heaven and hell and the afterlife to address the many questions that kind of rumble around in our heads and are presented by different religious organizations and groups. And as we've looked at the scriptures, we've seen that heaven, at least in a little tiny way, can sometimes be experienced here on earth, and that we get to participate in that. But that's not the whole story. Because despite the dragons and the seas and the swords and the bloodshed and the tears and all the pain, John doesn't see the destruction of the earth or the destruction of humanity. John sees a new heaven coming down to us, and earth hasn't been destroyed. The promise is a new city, a new creation, right here in the midst of this one. What God ultimately does is come again to us as gift, which is what God has done over and over and over throughout the scriptures. In the garden, God comes. In the womb, God comes. In the manger, in the cross. And then at the end of time, heaven and earth kiss. And God fully embraces earth. And heaven is fully realized. Because what it says is earth is made new and heaven is made new. That all is reborn. Everything comes together. Now, we don't know. People often ask me, but what's that heaven going to look like? But we don't know what that's going to look like. The scriptures say very, very little about how heaven fully realized will look. But what is revealed is how heaven will be felt. I know many of you have had experiences where you have been where you've been able to be with someone as they are dying, a physical death. And you may not be able to explain in words what you saw, but you do know that when you looked in their eyes that it wasn't fear. And many of us know in those moments that death does not have the last word. One thing we know about heaven is that there will be no more death. And the other thing we know about heaven is there will be no more tears. And it's not just that God's going to wipe away those fresh tears of the pain that just happened, but that God will reach back through all the ages of pain and suffering and wipe away every single tear that's ever been shed for whatever's happened. The promise here is that the chain reaction of human sin will be ended. Which means that not only will God wipe away our individual sadness, but also that God will wipe away all the sadness and injustices that we have caused. No guilt and no shame, no pain and no worry. Nothing holding God back. Who can fight against a dragon? God. And who will fight against all those forces who seek to destroy us? God. That is the promise. Today we gave thanks for the gift of baptism, for the gift of life. But the piece that we sometimes forget when we are baptizing a newborn baby is that we actually first die in those waters. That our sinful nature is put to death by God, and it is drowned in those waters, and we are raised to new life. We are saved in our death. The end is actually the beginning of what God can do. Dying for God is entrance to life. The end is not the end. It's the beginning. So I'd say that if we ever start to worry about end times, about life after death, about heaven, about whether we are okay in God's eyes, if that's ever your worry, that you would look back to what God has done in the past. Because whenever things seemed like they were the end, they weren't. They were the beginning of new creation. As John says, write this down. Because my words are trustworthy and true, see, I am making all things new. The end of time will be the beginning of time. A new heaven, a new earth. The same love of God. Amen.